I've opened the Particle Flow Grass 2 sample file, which you should open if you're jumping in here. Otherwise, I'm just continuing on from the previous video. Now it's time to create the particle flow source. On the Create panel under Geometry, choose Particle Systems, Particle Flow Source, and drag out the icon somewhere in the viewport. Now in some situations, you might want to emit particles from this icon itself. If you look closely, there's an arrow on the icon that represents the emission direction, and by default it's down. That would come into play if the particles were moving in time. But here we have a situation where we want static particles that are defined by this material. Open the Particle View dialog box by clicking this button, and you'll see a standard flow setup. We have the source here, which renders the geometry, and we have the event, which controls the birth and all of the other parameters relating to the particles. I'll click on birth, and we'll see the parameters for this node over here. I'd like the particles to be emitted starting at frame 0 and stopping at frame 0 also. That means that we'll have a static set of particles. I don't want to position the particles based on this icon, so I'm going to turn this off by clicking the icon. And notice how the particles disappear. Instead, I want to position them using an object, so I'll drag this node out and put it into Event 1. Click on it to see its parameters. I'll add an emitter object to the list by clicking on the landform. Notice that the particles are now distributed across the landform surface. I'll scroll down over here and set the density by material. Here we will use the grayscale information of the material to constrain the particles. And now you can see that they are indeed forming within that white area. Now let's get a better look at the things by going into the material editor, and we'll go into the map here where we set up the gradient ramp, and we will uncheck Show Map in Viewport. Now we just have a gray surface that we can use to visualize the grass. But the particles still exist within that mapped area. Okay, so moving on, we don't want the particles to move, so I'll turn off speed. We do want them to rotate, and right now I'll just leave this at random 3D, and we'll come back to this later. I don't want to use tetrahedrons, I'll turn that off. Instead, I want to use a shape instance, so I'll drag that in and drop it into the event. Click on it to see the parameters, and then click on this button. And now I'd like to select one of the grass objects, which might be difficult, so I'll press H to open up the Pick Object dialog box, and here I will select Blade 1. Notice that you can only select one object here, and by selecting the parent, we will also be integrating all of its children into particle flow. So I'll pick that. And now we're instancing Blade 1 as our particle. Right now the display node is showing us tick marks on the screen. I'll click on that and change the type to geometry. And finally, we can start to see the grass appear on the landscape. Now it's going every which way at this point because we have rotation set to random 3D. I'm going to change that to world space. And then I'll set the X orientation to 90 degrees, and that rotates the grass up. Now, I'd like to have a little variation in there, so I can either set divergence to a value, let's say 25 degrees. But that's going to orient the grass every which way. We can restrict the divergence to a particular axis. It can be the x-axis. We can have a little bit of y as well. Let's say that's 0.1. So we'll get a little bit of leaning in there. Not so bad. Now we'll go back up to the birth event and add additional particles. Let's say that we have 3,000. And suddenly we have lots of grass. Notice that some of the grass is outside of the boundary. We can correct that by going to Position Object and saying down here somewhere, if location is invalid, delete those particles. There we go. Now the particles exist within that area that we defined, and you can control everything that has to do with the particles by managing this event. This is just scratching the surface of what Particle View can do, but I hope it's given you food for thought.